Boston, Massachusetts, spring 1994. In the soft warmth of a New England spring morning in 1994, when the sun slanted gold through budding maple trees and the air still held the smell of last night's rain on brick sidewalks, Margaret Turner, 68 years old, sat in her modest colonial home in Roxbury, living as though she were a widow, though she had never had the closure of a grave, nor the certainty of his death. Her husband, Captain Thomas Turner of the U.S. Army, had vanished in 1950 during Korea, missing in action, leaving behind only a telegram delivered by the War Department. Missing in action, presumed dead. That telegram severed their lives in two, one half frozen in dread and hope, the other carried onward by Margaret alone. Their home had been built in the 1930s, with a steep roof and a white clapboard facade. She patch-painted peeling trim each summer, keeping the place tidy as if Thomas might return through the front gate at any moment. In the parlor, an upright piano he once played stood silent, dust gathering on the bench. In the bedroom, his uniform, once crisp, now yellowing with time, hung untouched in the closet, the brass buttons dim, the sleeves slightly faded from the window's light. On her dresser sat the wedding photograph, the one taken before he shipped out. He in his dress uniform, she in a simple dress, smiles bright but eyes wreathed in foreboding. The ring he gave her glinted on her finger every day, though for years she had no reason to believe it ever would again. Margaret worked at the public library downtown, cataloguing books, checking in returns, helping children find fairy tales and history alike, and in each manila envelope she touched, in each page she turned, there was always a moment, an echo of what might have been. Neighbors, aware of her husband's disappearance, offered condolences, suggested moving on, remarriage, but Margaret refused. To her, widowhood was not a role, but a condition, suspended between memory and absence, with love as her tether and faith as her ballast. Then one Tuesday in April 1994, precisely at 8:17 a.m., and as she arranged a vase of yellow daffodils on the windowsill overlooking Massachusetts Avenue, the telephone rang. The voice on the line was soft, professional, hushed, as though hesitant to break something delicate. It was a doctor from a psychiatric hospital in upstate New York. Patient without identification, in their care for decades, had begun repeating one name over and over. Margaret. Margaret Turner. He described her as she had been, dark hair swept back in a bun, faint laugh lines, the sound of her voice when she said his name. Margaret's hands froze on the daffodils. The moment the doctor mentioned, he spoke of her walk, her hat, that familiar postal route she once took to drop letters in the mailbox. She understood. Perhaps she should believe. She pocketed an old leather box from the top shelf of her closet. Inside, Thomas's letters from Korea, notebooks, dog-eared pages that smelled of tobacco and campfire. The uniform jacket that once fit just right, now stiff with age. The wedding band she'd never removed, even though the weight felt heavier each year. She called her younger son, David, across the wooden stairs. She said one sentence, "We have to go see this man. It might be your father. And if it truly was him, what then of all the years of silence, all the nights lighting candles, all the empty side of the bed? If this story touches you as it touched me writing it, leave a like and subscribe. It helps us keep sharing stories that inspire, move, and surprise. And now, brace yourself, because what comes next will change everything." She remembered the moment as clearly as the day it happened, though nearly 44 years had passed. It was late autumn in 1950, and the wind off the Charles River had a bitter sharpness that cut through coats and gloves, and Margaret had just returned from the grocery store, paper bag in her arms, filled with butter, potatoes, and a tin of coffee. She was still removing her gloves when the doorbell rang. Standing there was a uniformed courier from the Department of the Army, his face grave, the corners of his mouth tight with rehearsed solemnity as he handed her a sealed envelope, saluted, and left without a word. She stood in the doorway with the envelope in hand, the cold creeping up her spine. Inside, the words were few, typed on government-issue paper, crisp and impersonal, each line spaced with the cold formality of bureaucratic grief. Captain Thomas R. Turner, Army Serial Number 17804-3012, is missing in action as of October 28, 1950, in the vicinity of the Chongchon River, Korea, presumed dead. She had to read it twice before the meaning soaked in. The groceries spilled on the floor, butter rolled under the radiator, the coffee tin tipped, scattering grounds like soil across the linoleum. That night she didn't cry. Instead, she sat at the kitchen table with her hands folded, staring at the radio as Glenn Miller played something cheerful and cruel. In the years that followed, Margaret Turner never hosted a memorial. There was no flag-draped casket, no folding of the stars, no taps played by a lone bugler in the cemetery. There was only absence, thick, silent, and permanent. Her neighbors mourned and moved on. Some remarried, others changed addresses, jobs, even hairstyles. But Margaret remained anchored in their home, in their rituals, in the memories that others tried politely to avoid mentioning. Every morning, she placed a cup of black coffee on the side of the table where Thomas used to sit. Every night, she turned on the porch light and left it burning. In their bedroom, she never rearranged his dresser drawers. His old Navy shaving kit remained in the bathroom cabinet, dried soap still nestled inside. His green field jacket hung behind the closet door, worn soft at the elbows, the pocket still containing the Metro pass he'd used the day before he deployed. She dusted it once a week, running a cloth gently along the shoulders like brushing the back of a sleeping man. In the attic was a trunk of his letters, bundled with twine, ink faded but legible, pages filled with jokes, stories about life on base, questions about the boys, longings for a return that would never come. She raised their two sons, James and David, with quiet resilience, instilling in them values Thomas had cherished: respect, duty, kindness, without weakness. She never spoke ill of the war, or of the military, or even of God, though sometimes, after Sunday Mass, she would sit alone in the pew for a few minutes longer, staring at the stained glass behind the altar as if waiting for something. Not a vision, not an answer, but perhaps just the faint suggestion of peace. The world changed, but Margaret remained in a time capsule of devotion. When David returned from college and suggested she sell the house and move into a condo near his in Chicago, she smiled and said, "What would your father say if he came home and I wasn't here?" It wasn't a rhetorical question. To her, it was practical. Then came the call, so unexpected it nearly didn't register. April 1994, a spring morning like any other. She was clipping dead leaves from the tulips in the garden when the phone rang. She wiped her hands on a towel, picked up the receiver, and heard a voice, female, warm but clinical, introduce herself as Dr. Elaine Myers from Hudson Valley Psychiatric Hospital in Poughkeepsie, New York. "I apologize for the intrusion," she said, "but we have a patient here. Elderly, long-term, no identification, no family history. He's been with us since the early 50s. Recently, he began repeating a name, yours. He says it several times a day. Margaret Turner." Margaret's hand clutched the receiver tighter. "There's more," the doctor continued. "He also described you. Your voice, your wedding dress, a garden with yellow tulips, and a porch with a chime that rings when the wind shifts." She sat down slowly on the kitchen chair, her legs trembling. Her first instinct was disbelief, but it was followed, almost instantly, by something more dangerous: hope. Wild, reckless hope, as if the very name had reached across time and carried something of her back into his memory. She went to the closet, pulled down the old trunk from the top shelf. She opened it, inhaled the smell of old paper, cedar, and the faint trace of his aftershave. She took out the photo album, the letters, the ring he gave her in 1947, the tiny box that once held the cufflinks she'd saved for his return. Her fingers brushed the lapel of his uniform, and for the first time in years, she didn't cry. She stood, quiet and steady. She called David and said only, "We're going to New York. I think your father might be alive." The hospital stood on the edge of the Hudson River, its wide brick facade softened by decades of ivy and storms, an old structure that looked less like a place of healing and more like somewhere time went to rest, a place where memories either resurfaced slowly or disappeared altogether. Margaret and David arrived on a damp Thursday morning, mist curling over the parking lot, the smell of pine and antiseptic drifting in through the open lobby doors. The psychiatric wing was quiet, insulated, distant from the rhythm of the outside world. It was here that Thomas Turner had been living, not for days, not for months, but for over 40 years. The administrator, a kind woman in her 50s named Karen, met them at the entrance to the ward. She held a folder close to her chest, her voice practiced and careful as she led them down a narrow hallway lined with faded photographs of the institution's past. They passed rooms with partially open doors, glimpses of patients sitting quietly in chairs, a television murmuring in the common area, soft slippers shuffling on tile. And then she stopped in front of room 112. "I need you to understand," Karen said gently. "He doesn't know who he is, not in the way you and I do. His name was never officially confirmed. When he arrived here in 1951, he had no identification, no dog tags, no documents, nothing. He was found wandering near the Catskills, confused, injured, dehydrated. He didn't speak for almost a year." Margaret listened, her fingers clenched tightly around the strap of her purse, nodding, absorbing each word like slow, cold water. "We listed him as John Doe for years. Internally, we called him Mr. T. He had episodes, confusion, disassociation, long stretches of silence. At first, we thought it was schizophrenia. Later, it became clear it was trauma, deep, sustained trauma from something he couldn't name. But in recent months," she paused, glancing toward the door, "he started to speak again. Not much, but the name Margaret Turner came out. First in fragments, then with certainty. Over and over, he repeated it like prayer. When they entered the room, Margaret was not prepared for what she saw. Not truly. The man sitting by the window was thin, his hair fully white, his shoulders slightly hunched, the lines in his face etched deep with time and sorrow. But there was something in the shape of his jaw, in the way he rested his hands on the windowsill, that pulled at her like a current under the surface. He didn't look up right away. He was watching the wind through the trees. "Mr. T," Karen said softly, "you have a visitor." He turned slowly. His eyes met Margaret's, and for a second, just a second, they flickered with something sharp and sudden. A flicker of recognition, memory, or just the echo of something he couldn't reach. Dr. Elaine Myers, the attending psychiatrist, joined them soon after. She carried a thick binder of notes and years of observations, and with quiet empathy, she began to tell the story of what they knew, or thought they knew, about the man they now suspected was Thomas Turner. "He was admitted in October 1951, she explained, sitting across from them in a small consultation room with beige walls and a box of tissues between them. He had a concussion, a shrapnel wound to the thigh, signs of prolonged exposure. He couldn't speak for months. When he did, it was incoherent. He didn't know his name. He didn't know where he was from. He was terrified of loud sounds, of uniforms, of mirrors." Margaret sat still, her hands folded in her lap, absorbing it all. In the 1960s, he became more stable, cooperative, quiet, capable of daily tasks. He learned routines, but the past remained locked away. The few words he ever uttered were disconnected. Sunday, letter, radio, Margaret. For years we believed these were meaningless or misremembered fragments. It was Dr. Myers who had taken it upon herself in recent months to begin a new search. Inspired by a growing movement in psychiatric care toward restorative memory therapy, she revisited the case. A new intern had overheard Thomas humming a melody one day, a tune from a Glenn Miller record. The same night, he had muttered the name Margaret Turner again. When they prompted him with questions, he mentioned Boston, tulips, and something about a lighthouse. It was vague, dreamlike, but enough to open a path. Dr. Myers started digging. Old military records, local archives, missing persons reports. She reached out to the VA. After nearly a dozen dead ends, she came across a listing in an archive database of MIA soldiers from the Korean War. Thomas R. Turner, Boston, MA, married to Margaret Ellen Turner. Status: missing, presumed deceased. It was like the clouds parted, she said. I knew we had to try to find you. Back in the room, Margaret approached Thomas slowly. She didn't say anything at first. She simply sat down beside him. A nurse brought in tea. She didn't look at the nurse. Her eyes stayed on him. After a few minutes, she took something from her purse, the photograph from their wedding day. She placed it gently in his lap. He stared at it. He didn't speak, but his hand hovered over the image, trembled, and then fell still. And Margaret whispered, not as a question, but as a statement that only a heart could utter. It's me. You're home. In the days that followed, Margaret visited Thomas every morning, arriving just as the nurses were completing their rounds, her footsteps echoing softly down the linoleum hallway, a paper bag tucked under one arm containing a thermos of black coffee and a small cloth-wrapped bundle of scones, the kind she used to bake on Sundays when the boys were small and the world still held form. She didn't expect recognition, not anymore. What she hoped for was something quieter, a presence, a flicker, a breath that moved differently when she entered the room, that suggested something in him still knew she had once mattered. Thomas rarely spoke. Some days he sat staring out the window, unmoving for hours, watching the branches sway like they were trying to tell him a story he used to know. Other days he shuffled slowly from his chair to the little bookshelf by the wall, where paperbacks with cracked spines and well-worn covers lined the shelves. He would run his fingers across the titles, not taking one down, just touching them like braille, and Margaret would sit nearby, knitting or reading aloud, not stories of the past, but pieces of the present. Headlines from the paper, letters from their grandchildren, passages from Psalms, and sometimes recipes from old cookbooks, describing how to make biscuits or roast chicken, as if reading them aloud could conjure the smell into the sterile air of the ward. At first, there was no response. Nothing in his posture, his eyes, his breath. But on the fifth day, as she unwrapped a lavender-scented handkerchief she'd brought with her, one she had embroidered herself in 1948 with the initials M and T, Thomas turned his head slightly toward the fabric, his nostrils flaring almost imperceptibly, as if the scent of lavender had nudged something buried deep inside. He didn't speak, but he reached out slowly and touched the cloth, then let his hand rest there, motionless. It wasn't much, but it was everything. Encouraged, Margaret began reintroducing things not through memory, but through sensation. A sprig of rosemary from her garden, a cassette tape of 1940s jazz, a photograph of their house in Roxbury with its porch swing and climbing ivy. One afternoon, she brought in a record player and placed it by the window. She set the needle down and let the scratchy notes of Moonlight Serenade drift into the room. Thomas didn't move, but he closed his eyes. And for a long, aching moment, his lips moved, not quite singing, not quite mouthing, just moving, like the melody was walking across his soul, tracing a path that had been dark for decades. By the second week, the nurses had begun calling her Mrs. T with affection, smiling when she came in, leaving small vases of fresh flowers on his bedside table, choosing songs more carefully when playing the radio in the common room. Margaret had become part of the rhythm of the place, and though Thomas still floated somewhere between here and elsewhere, there were moments now, brief, glimmering, when he seemed to anchor, to tether to something real. One morning, as Margaret poured coffee into a small cup and placed it beside him, Thomas reached for it before she prompted him. He didn't drink it. He held it, letting the warmth seep into his hands, and then, in a voice hoarse with years of disuse, he said, "You always added sugar after the stir." Margaret froze. It was not a question. It was not a hallucination. It was a fact. A small, silly detail, but it was theirs. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and added 2 cubes to her own cup, stirring quietly. Another time, she showed him a faded photo of their sons as teenagers, taken in the driveway before prom. Thomas stared at the picture for a long time, then pointed to David and whispered, "That one always had a way of walking like me." These were not recoveries in the clinical sense. The doctors did not expect a miracle, no full restoration of memory, no sudden clarity, but the pieces were returning, scattered, like letters from a long-lost journal, rediscovered in a dusty attic. Dr. Myers called it relational memory, the way the body and spirit remember what the mind forgets. She encouraged Margaret to continue, not with pressure, not with questions, but with presence. And so she did, without expectations, without demand. She read, she sat, she listened, and one day, as the sunlight poured across the hardwood floor in room 112 and the scent of fresh apple pie from the cafeteria wafted in, Thomas reached out and touched her cheek. "You had freckles when we met," he said softly. "I used to count them when you fell asleep on the train back from Cape Cod." She did not cry. She smiled. That was the day Margaret stopped thinking of him as a patient. He might never remember every year they spent apart. He might never be able to piece together where he had gone, what he had endured, what part of him had survived. But he had found her again, not because he remembered the whole of their life, but because something in him recognized the feeling of being loved without condition. And that, she decided, was enough. What began as a private, almost sacred rediscovery between Margaret and Thomas, quiet visits, whispered recollections, the slow unearthing of a man beneath layers of silence, slowly began to spill into the world beyond the hospital walls. Not because Margaret sought attention, nor because she wished to tell the story publicly, but because stories, when they carry the weight of love and loss, tend to find their own voice. It started with a nurse named Olivia, who had worked at Hudson Valley Psychiatric for over 20 years and had seen hundreds of cases pass through those halls, some forgotten, some healed, some simply gone. But what she saw between Margaret and Thomas moved her in ways that clinical training couldn't explain. She contacted a local journalist, a woman who'd written human interest pieces for the Poughkeepsie Journal, and said simply, "There's someone here you need to meet. It's not a story, it's something more." The article appeared one Sunday morning under the headline, "Missing in Korea, Found in New York, a Love That Waited 44 Years." It was tender, restrained, no sensationalism, no dramatics, just a simple telling of a man presumed dead, now living in quiet anonymity, and the woman who never stopped being his wife. The response was immediate. Letters arrived at the hospital, at Margaret's home in Roxbury, and even at the Department of Veterans Affairs in Washington. Some were from former soldiers who'd served in Korea. Others came from families who had their own missing loved ones, still waiting for answers. A retired archivist from the National Personnel Record Center contacted Dr. Myers personally to confirm Thomas's military record and cross-reference it with the hospital's anonymous admission logs from 1951. 2 weeks later, the Department of Defense issued an official statement. Captain Thomas R. Turner, previously listed as missing in action during the Korean War, has been located and identified. Status updated to survivor, retired honorably. There was no ceremony at first, just a letter, typed and signed, delivered to Margaret's home, its language formal but respectful. Along with it came a certificate, a folded American flag, and a bronze medallion recognizing service and sacrifice. But the moment felt different now. It wasn't closure, it was acknowledgement, a quiet correction to a mistake time and systems had tried to forget. Then in early September, Margaret received a phone call from the governor's office. A small ceremony was being organized, not at a military base, but at the Old North Church in Boston, chosen for its symbolism of endurance and history, of standing watch through time. It would be private, intimate, family only, a moment of restoration, not spectacle. On a cool, breezy afternoon, with the church bells echoing down the narrow cobblestone streets, Margaret stood beside Thomas as he was formally reinstated into the United States Army. Not as an active soldier, but as a man whose service was now known, whose disappearance had been mourned, and whose survival had finally been honored. He stood shakily, supported by David on one side and a nurse on the other. His uniform, newly tailored but modeled after the one he had last worn, hung neatly from his frame, the medals carefully pinned, the name Turner embroidered once more above his heart. He said nothing during the ceremony. He didn't need to. Margaret spoke instead, standing at the pulpit, looking not just at the few family members and close friends gathered in the pews, but beyond them, as if addressing everyone who had ever waited, searched, or believed without proof. She said, "I didn't return to being a wife, I returned to being present, and that is enough." There was no applause, just a long, warm silence, the kind that feels like sunlight after rain. Thomas, seated now, reached for her hand and held it loosely, his thumb brushing against her palm, like a memory trying to form again. After the service, they took a photograph together, not posed, not directed, just the two of them sitting on a bench outside the church, backs slightly curved, shoulders touching. Behind them, the brick steeple rose into the sky, and around them the city continued on, unaware, perhaps, of the quiet triumph that had just occurred on its streets. A few months later, Margaret had the old gravestone removed, the one that had stood in Mount Auburn Cemetery since 1952, with the inscription, Captain Thomas R. Turner, presumed KIA Korea, 1950. And in its place, she commissioned a new marker, simple granite, understated, and set flush with the earth. The new inscription read, "Here lies the silence, for Thomas lived, and he returned." When asked by a reporter why she hadn't chosen to rewrite the entire history, to reclaim every lost year, Margaret smiled softly and said, "Some stories don't need to be rewritten. They just need to be seen." Dummies! In the months that followed the ceremony, life did not transform into some polished version of happiness. There were no dramatic returns, no cinematic memories regained, no sudden undoing of decades lost. But there was something softer, a rhythm that formed between Margaret and Thomas, not built on the past they once shared, but on the present they now inhabited. Thomas remained in the long-term care wing of a smaller veterans' home just outside Boston, nestled between tall pine trees and the hum of quiet roads. The nurses knew Margaret by name. Every afternoon at 2:15 p.m., she arrived with a tote bag over her arm, sometimes with books, sometimes with crossword puzzles, sometimes just with silence and a thermos of tea. And together they sat, not as the couple they once were, but as two people who had survived the violence of forgetting. They didn't talk much. There was no need. Some days Thomas would drift in and out of awareness, his gaze fixed on some invisible horizon. Other days, he would tap his foot lightly when a big band tune came on the radio. Once, when Margaret handed him a piece of her lemon cake, he looked at her with a smile and said, "You used to make that on my birthday." She didn't correct him. His birthday was in winter and it was July, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that the thread was still there, even if frayed, even if thin. It had never truly snapped. She never removed her wedding ring. Not during the years of presumed widowhood, and not now. She never changed her last name. Her mailbox still read Turner, and her phone number, unchanged since 1963, still received the occasional wrong number from an era before cell phones. The house in Roxbury, modest and slightly faded now, still held the framed photo of their wedding day on the mantel. But beside it, Margaret added a new photograph. It showed the two of them sitting side by side on a bench at the VA hospital, hands folded in their laps, looking not at the camera, but out toward a pond where ducks drifted under a grey New England sky. There were no smiles, just a kind of peace and acceptance, the quiet victory of presence over absence. At Mount Auburn Cemetery, the old marker that once memorialized a man presumed dead now stood replaced by a stone that bore no rank, no war, only words chosen with care and carved with love. Here lies the silence, for Thomas lived, and he returned. Margaret never sought to reclaim the years. She never asked him where he'd been, what he remembered, or what he didn't. To do so would be to chase shadows, and she had learned long ago that love, true love, doesn't need to prove itself by the weight of memory. It only needs to show up, and so she did, every day. Not as a woman trying to recover a husband, but as someone simply willing to be there, to hold a hand, to offer a cup of tea, to sit in stillness beside the man who for a time had disappeared, but had somehow, against the odds, found his way back. We share new stories every day, true stories that inspire and remind us what it means to feel, to wait, and to hope.